If you drove through Kings County, California in 2022, looking out the window, you'd have seen, well, nothing but dry, flat, dusty fields.
Yeah, just endless dust.
Right. Endless rows of cotton, tomatoes, almonds, just stretching all the way to the horizon. It looked like the absolute definition of permanent engineered land. But if you drove down that exact same road just 6 months later, in the spring of 2023, you would have needed a submarine.
Right, yeah, submarine, yeah.
Literally, because the fields were gone. The tractors were entirely underwater. The roads just disappeared into a body of water so vast that waves were literally crashing against temporary dirt levees. We are talking about a 150-year-old ghost lake that just woke up.
It's incredible.
And what's so fascinating about this ghost lake returning is that it reveals a massive invisible debt hidden beneath the soil. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're looking at the California San Joaquin Valley water crisis. And we're going to look at it exactly like a bank ledger that has finally come due after a century of, well, reckless withdrawals.
It forces a completely different perspective on what we consider permanent,
Right.
Because we usually think of debts and ledgers in very human terms, like a bank loan or a mortgage.
Sure, there's a piece of paper, a number.
Exactly, a very binary state of being paid or unpaid. But I know you've been following California's water politics closely, so today we really want to bypass the standard drought headlines you've probably already read.
Yeah, the typical it's dry out there news.
Right. We want to look at the actual physics of what is happening underground in the valley. We are looking at a geological ledger that has been running a massive deficit for a century. And the bill is finally coming due. And it's important to set the tone here. This is a measured reckoning. It's not a scold.
Right, we're not just pointing fingers.
Exactly. It requires looking fairly at all the participants, from the rural households to the large growers. Because, honestly, they all acted rationally within a ruleless system. They just collectively broke the bank.
Yeah, and to do this, we're pulling from a really solid stack of sources. We've got public historical records, USGS data, NASA JPL satellite tracking.
That satellite data is wild, by the way.
Oh, it's unbelievable. We're also looking at California Department of Water Resources reports, some really great analyses from the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, Agriculture Press like AgAlert, and even a really poignant first-person eyewitness account from a lifelong Californian.
So we have the hard science and the human element.
Exactly. So to understand this ledger, you really have to go back to how this debt started. We're looking at the San Joaquin Valley's aquifer, and I think the common misconception is that an aquifer is basically like a subterranean lake.
Oh, yeah, the underground cavern myth.
Right, just a giant cave filled with splashing water, waiting for someone to drop a big straw into it.
That imagery is incredibly persistent, but it's fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
To understand the physical crisis happening in the valley right now, you have to picture the geology correctly. The valley floor is essentially a massive, incredibly deep layer cake. It's composed of sand, gravel, and clay that was laid down over millennia by ancient rivers and glacial runoff from the Sierra Nevada mountains.
So it's solid ground.
Yes, solid ground. The water isn't sitting in a cavern. It is occupying the microscopic spaces, the pore spaces, between those millions of particles of sand and gravel.
Okay, so it's more like water saturating a massive rocky sponge.
Yes, that's a great way to picture it. And it took thousands of years of rain and snow melt slowly seeping down through the earth to fill those microscopic spaces.
A very slow deposit.
Right. That ancient water was the initial deposit in this geographical savings account. And for most of the state's history, the laws governing how you could access that savings account were completely disconnected from the physical reality of the resource.
Yeah, the sources make this point very clear when they contrast surface water with groundwater. Because starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, surface water in California, the rivers, the streams, became highly regulated.
Highly regulated.
That's right. There were these elaborate legal battles over riparian rights and appropriative rights. Basically, every drop of surface water was accounted for, fought over, and metered. But groundwater was treated under a completely different paradigm.
Yeah, it was treated under what's called the rule of capture. Historically, if you owned the parcel of land at the surface, you had the right to sink a well and pump as much water as you could physically pull out of the ground.
Right, no limits at all?
None. No limits, no meters, and no state oversight. It was the most forgiving source of water available because it asked absolutely no questions.
Wow. Which sets up an incredible paradox. You have this massive agricultural economy operating in a semi-arid climate, subject to frequent and severe droughts.
Right.
And when a drought hits like those major dry periods we saw from, 2007 to 2009, then 2012 to 2016, and again from 2020 to 2022, the highly regulated surface water allocations get slashed.
The canals just run dry.
Exactly. And the immediate, completely legal response was just to turn to the unregulated savings account, the groundwater.
It becomes a textbook case of game theory, specifically the tragedy of the commons. Because that underground layer cake of water we talked about, it doesn't respect property lines.
Obviously not.
Right. So if a farmer puts in a high-capacity industrial pump and starts drawing thousands of gallons a minute, they aren't just pulling water from straight beneath their own dirt. They're creating what hydrologists call a cone of depression.
A cone of depression. So that's like a localized drop in the water table that basically sucks water in from the surrounding areas.
Precisely. The water flows through the sand and gravel toward the lowest pressure point. So if your neighbor drills a deeper well and turns on a massive pump, the water level underneath your property physically drops.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Your shallow well might suddenly start pulling up air.
So what is your counter move? I mean, if your livelihood depends on your orchard surviving the summer, your only rational defense is to hire a drilling rig, bore a deeper hole than your neighbor, and buy a bigger pump.
And then your neighbor has to do the exact same thing. It initiates a relentless race to the bottom. Each individual participant is making a perfectly rational, economically necessary decision to protect their own investment.
Sure, they have to.
But collectively, the entire valley is aggressively accelerating the depletion of a shared finite resource.
The human cost of this dynamic is laid out in really stark terms in the reporting from the PPIC and the agricultural press. Because when this race to the bottom accelerates, the people who lose first aren't the villains or the giant corporate farming operations with deep pockets.
No, not at all.
The immediate casualties are the rural households and the small family farms.
Right, because the disparity in infrastructure dictates who survives the drought. A massive, capitalized agricultural operation can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to sink a well 1,000 feet deep.
Which is insane to think about.
It is. But a rural homeowner living in an unincorporated community, they often rely on a domestic well that might only be 50 or 100 feet deep.
I was reading accounts of these communities in the sources, and the reality is incredibly grim. You have towns situated in the middle of the most productive agricultural valley in the world, generating billions of dollars in food, and the residents are hauling plastic jugs of drinking water from state-funded distribution tanks.
Just to have drinking water.
Because their kitchen taps are completely dry. And all the while, just a mile down the road, massive diesel engines are running day and night, pumping deep aquifer water to keep the almond orchards green.
It really highlights a severe structural flaw in an unregulated system. When there's no central accounting for a shared resource, the consequences of overdrafting it are distributed entirely based on who has the capital to dig deeper, rather than who actually needs the water to survive.
It's like a savings account with no tiller. You only realize you're bankrupt when your tap suddenly spits air. But it makes you ask, how did an entire state just ignore the bottom of the well for a century?
Well, out of sight, out of mind, right?
Yeah.
Until the ground itself started keeping the books.
Yes, that's what really caught my attention. Human policy ignored it, but the physical earth did not. The geology is a very strict auditor.
An unforgiving auditor.
Let's get into the mechanics of this, because the actual physics of what happens when you pull that much water out of the ground completely recontextualized this crisis for me. We're talking about aquifer compaction.
Yes.
The literal sinking of the valley floor, which is known as subsidence.
Right. To understand subsidence, we have to look closely at those clay layers within the aquifer. We mentioned the sand and gravel earlier. Those materials are relatively rigid. They form the structural scaffolding of the aquifer.
Okay.
But the clay layers intercalated between the sand and gravel, they behave very differently.
Because clay is much more compressible.
It is. Under natural conditions, those deep clay layers are fully saturated with water.
Yeah.
And that water isn't just sitting there passively. It is exerting hydrostatic pressure outward.
So it's pushing back against the earth.
Exactly. At a molecular level, clay particles look like tiny, flat plates. When the clay is saturated, the water pressure forces those flat plates to remain separated in a somewhat random, chaotic orientation, almost like a house of cards.
Huh.
The water pressure is literally helping to support the immense lithostatic pressure, which is the millions of tons of earth and rock pressing down from above.
So the water actually acts as a structural load-bearing column.
Exactly. Now, when a massive agricultural pump creates a deep cone of depression, it creates a pressure differential. It effectively starts sucking the water out of the pore spaces within those clay layers.
And as the water leaves,
The hydrostatic pressure drops.
and the house of cards collapses.
The lithostatic wave from above simply crushes the clay. Those microscopic flat plates of clay lose the water pressure holding them apart, and they succumb to the weight. They reorient themselves. They flatten out and lie directly on top of one another, packing tightly together.
You know, my initial thought when reading about this was to compare it to a kitchen sponge. You take a wet, puffy sponge, squeeze all the water out, and it shrinks into a flat, rigid little square.
Right.
But the difference here, and this is the part that is so crucial for long-term sustainability, is that if I put that dry sponge back under the faucet, it absorbs the water and puffs right back up to its original size.
And that is the terrifying difference with the San Joaquin Valley clay. It does not puff back up.
Wait, really? Not at all?
Not at all. When those clay particles reorient and lock together, the molecular structure of the clay is fundamentally altered. That compaction is entirely irreversible.
Oh, wow. So this is fundamentally a one-way street. We aren't just draining a reservoir. We are permanently destroying the reservoir's physical capacity to exist.
You're losing the container itself. You could hypothetically dump the entire volume of the Pacific Ocean on top of the San Joaquin Valley, and that crushed clay will never expand again. The storage space is permanently gone, squeezed out of existence.
And when you multiply that microscopic collapse across thousands of square miles, the macroscopic result is that the surface of the Earth literally drops. The scale of this land loss is documented by the USGS, and the numbers are just hard to wrap your head around. By 1970, they found that more than a foot of subsidence had occurred across approximately 5,200 square miles.
Which is roughly half the entire valley.
Half the valley sank a foot. It's completely wild. And it's an insidious phenomenon because it happens slowly, over decades. If you're standing in a field that's sinking an inch or two a year, your human senses can't perceive it.
Right. Everything looks flat.
The horizon looks exactly the same.
Which is why the work of Joseph F. Poland was so critical in making this invisible crisis visible.
Ah, yes.
Poland was a hydrologist for the USGS who spent decades studying aquifer system compaction in the valley, largely using tools called extensometers.
I was reading about these. They basically drill a deep borehole down into the aquifer, anchor a cable or a pipe to the bottom of the hole, and measure how much the surface casing moves relative to that deep anchor over time.
Exactly. It allows you to track the exact rate of compaction. But Poland's most enduring contribution to this issue wasn't just a spreadsheet of extensometer data. It was a single, iconic photograph taken in 1977 near Mendota, California.
It is an incredible image. For those who haven't seen it, he's standing in this completely flat, nondescript agricultural field next to a wooden utility pole. And attached to this pole are 3 signs indicating where the actual surface of the Earth used to be.
Right.
The sign for 1977 is right near his boots. The sign for 1955 is mounted above his head, and the sign for 1925 is way, way up at the top of the pole.
It indicates a maximum ground loss of approximately 28 feet.
28 feet. That is a 3-story building. A 3-story building's worth of solid ground simply vanished beneath his feet over the course of 52 years.
Staggering.
The air he is breathing near the bottom of that pole used to be buried under nearly 30 feet of earth.
When you look at Poland's photograph, the abstract concept of an overdrafted ledger becomes an undeniable physical reality. You can literally see the depth. And while Poland had to rely on boreholes and utility poles to measure this in the 20th century, the sources detail how modern science tracks this sinking today. The technology has evolved from the ground level to orbit.
Yes. The tracking being done now by the USGS and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA JPL, they're using INSAR.
Interferometric synthetic aperture radar.
The mechanics of INSAR are fascinating. Instead of relying on isolated well measurements, these satellites are constantly orbiting the Earth, shooting microwave radar pulses down at the valley floor. The radar hits the ground and bounces back up to the satellite.
Right, and what the satellite is actually measuring is the phase shift in those returning microwave signals.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, by comparing the exact time it takes for a radar wave to return on a Tuesday versus the time it takes to return on a pass 1 month later, the software can calculate the change in the distance to the ground with astonishing precision.
Like, how precise are we talking?
Down to the millimeter scale.
Millimeters. From space. That's insane.
Yes. INSAR provides a continuous, highly detailed, color-coded map of exactly where the Earth is sagging and how fast. And what those satellite maps reveal is a cruel irony about the physical cost of this sinking.
Oh, because it doesn't sink evenly.
Exactly. The ground doesn't sink perfectly evenly across the valley. It creates massive, subtle bowls and depressions depending on the specific underlying geology and where the heaviest pumping is occurring.
Which introduces a whole new level of consequence. The sinking isn't just an abstract geological phenomenon, it is actively destroying the valley's critical infrastructure.
The very infrastructure that was built to import water and relieve the valley's reliance on groundwater pumping in the first place.
Right. Let's break down exactly how this happens, looking specifically at the Fremont-Kern Canal, which is heavily featured in the state reports. This is a massive, concrete-lined artificial river designed to carry surface water 152 miles down the eastern side of the valley.
And the engineering of a gravity-fed canal like the Fremont-Kern is incredibly precise.
Yeah.
You are trying to move millions of gallons of water over vast distances without using pumps.
Just relying on gravity.
Exactly. To do that, the canal relies on a highly calculated, constant downward slope. The gradient has to be perfect to keep the water flowing smoothly from the source to the destination.
But if the ground beneath a 10-mile stretch of that canal sinks by several feet due to aquifer compaction, that perfect gradient is ruined.
Completely ruined. You develop a massive sag in the canal, the water reaches the sunken section and loses its momentum. It pools in the depression rather than flowing downstream. The hydraulics of the entire system are compromised.
And because it's pooling, the water level in that sunken section rises closer and closer to the top of the concrete banks.
Right, the freeboard is lost.
So to prevent the water from overtopping the banks and flooding the surrounding area, the operators have no choice but to dial back the amount of water they release into the canal at the very beginning of the system.
So you suffer a catastrophic loss of conveyance capacity. The state reports indicate that because of this regional subsidence, the middle reach of the Fremont-Kern Canal lost roughly 60% of its capacity to deliver water.
60%. That is a staggering reduction in surface water delivery.
It is.
And this creates what looks like a textbook geological death spiral. The farmers pump groundwater because they need water. Pumping the groundwater causes the clay layers to collapse, which sinks the earth. The sinking earth buckles the canals. The buckled canals can no longer deliver surface water.
Right, and then what?
Desperate to keep their trees alive, they have to pump even more groundwater to make up for the surface water they aren't getting from the broken canal.
Which causes more compaction, more sinking, and further destruction of the canal. The system feeds on its own failure. And fixing a buckled canal isn't as simple as patching a pothole.
Right, you can't just jack up a concrete river. Is there any way to unbend it, or is this just permanent geographic vandalism?
It's essentially permanent. You basically have to demolish the compromised section and engineer a completely new parallel canal next to it, or build massive new concrete retaining walls to restore the original freeboard.
Wow.
We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in repair costs just to regain the capacity that was originally designed. The financial burden of the pumping isn't just the cost of diesel for the well, it's the destruction of billion-dollar public works projects.
The sheer scale of this infrastructure damage, combined with the optics of thousands of domestic wells running dry during the drought, finally pushed the state to intervene. For 100 years, Sacramento looked the other way on groundwater. But the physical reality of buckled canals and a collapsing valley floor forced a legal reckoning.
Which brings us to the legislation that is currently reshaping the entire future of the valley. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, passed in September of 2014.
The timing of SGMA is not a coincidence. 2014 was the height of one of the most punishing droughts in modern California history. The political inertia that had protected the rule of capture for a century finally broke under the weight of the crisis. But what I find so interesting about SGMA is how the state chose to structure the intervention.
Yeah, it was a very calculated political and administrative choice. The state legislature knew that a top-down mandate, where bureaucrats in Sacramento simply dictate hard pumping quotas for every farm in the state, would ignite an absolute political firestorm.
Oh, absolutely.
Furthermore, every groundwater basin in California has entirely different geology, different hydrology, and different economic drivers.
You can't regulate the rainy north the exact same way you regulate the desert south.
Exactly. So instead of a blanket quota, SGMA relies on local control. It required the formation of local groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs.
SGMA essentially handed the problem back to the local communities and said, you form an agency, you draw the boundaries, you write the management plans, and you enforce the pumping limits. The state will give you the framework, but you have to prove to us that your basin will achieve sustainability.
Right. And the timeline they established for this sustainability is the source of intense debate. The law dictates that these critically overdrafted basins in the San Joaquin Valley must end their chronic overdraft by the early 2040s.
2040. So this timeline is often characterized by analysts as giving the valley a generation to fix a century.
Right, a generation to fix a century.
I mean, the phrasing is poetic, but when you look at the physical reality we just discussed, the irreversible collapse of the clay, the destruction of the canals, it forces a question. If your house is actively on fire, you don't form a 20-year local committee to debate the best way to purchase fire hoses, right?
It's a fair point.
Do slow legal fixes actually solve a fast-moving physical crisis?
That is the central tension of SGMA's design, and it requires looking fairly at the economics of the valley. The argument for the 20-year glide path is rooted in the immense scale of the agricultural economy.
Okay, how so?
The San Joaquin Valley isn't just growing a few local crops. It is a vital artery of the global food supply chain, producing billions of dollars in nuts, fruits, and dairy.
Right.
If you simply outlawed groundwater pumping overnight, the economic shockwave would be catastrophic.
You would instantly bankrupt thousands of agricultural businesses.
Yes, wipe out tens of thousands of farm worker jobs and collapse the tax base of every rural county in the region. The 20-year timeline was designed to allow the local economy to ease into the cold water, to slowly transition their operations, secure new water sources, or wind down acreage without inducing a sudden regional depression.
But the danger of the glide path is that while the local GSAs spend a decade writing their plans and holding meetings, the pumps are still running.
Exactly. The overdraft continues. The clay continues to compact. And this is exactly why the sources emphasize that the real, visceral bite of the 2014 law is only truly arriving right now as we approach the late 2020s.
The planning phase is over. The enforcement phase has arrived.
And enforcement means moving from abstract goals to actual restrictions. GSAs are having to implement mechanisms to actually track and limit what comes out of the ground.
So actual meters?
Yes, installing telemetry and smart meters on private agricultural wells, which is a massive cultural shift for farmers who have operated independently for generations.
And regardless of whether the timeline is fast or slow, the mathematical reality of what these GSAs have to accomplish by 2040 demands a brutal subtraction from the ledger. To explore this, we have to look at the data provided by the Public Policy Institute of California regarding fallowing.
The arithmetic of SGMA is unforgiving. To reach sustainability, to stop the chronic lowering of the groundwater table, you simply have to balance the budget. You cannot consume more water than the basin naturally or artificially receives.
And because the vast, overwhelming majority of consumed water in the San Joaquin Valley goes toward agriculture, the equation is incredibly blunt. Less water mathematically guarantees less farmland.
The PPIC projections lay out the scale of this deficit. They estimate that to achieve balance, average annual farm water availability could fall by approximately 3.15 million acre-feet by 2040.
3.15 million acre-feet. The volume of that number is hard to visualize. So an acre-foot is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot, roughly 326,000 gallons.
Right.
The valley is looking at losing over 3 million of those acre-feet every single year. That represents roughly a fifth of the region's current total water supply.
It's massive. And when you translate that water loss into land impact, the PPIC estimates that somewhere between 500,000 to 900,000 acres of the valley's irrigated farmland will likely need to be fallowed.
Permanently taken out of production.
Yes, the water simply won't exist to keep those crops alive.
To put that in perspective, the valley currently has about 4.5 million irrigated acres. We are talking about erasing a massive percentage of the most productive agricultural land in the country.
It's huge.
And the PPIC report notes that even under a hyper-optimistic scenario, where the valley somehow innovates and secures 1 million acre-feet of brand new water supply, at least 500,000 acres still have to go dry.
This is where we must look at the human and economic realities detailed in the sources with strict neutrality. Because the debate over how this fallowing occurs is incredibly complex. 500,000 fallowed acres is not an abstract spreadsheet variable.
No.
It represents a fundamental restructuring of the region's socioeconomic fabric.
It's like a corporate downsizing, where the executives have golden parachutes, but the floor workers lose everything. It means generational family farms shutting down. It means a massive contraction in demand for farm labor, seed, tractors, and processing facilities,
which disproportionately impacts the rural, unincorporated communities throughout the valley. These towns are deeply dependent on the agricultural economy, and they're largely populated by lower-income and Latino residents.
Right.
If the farms around a town go fallow, the economic lifeblood of that town evaporates.
And this brings up a fierce debate regarding the equity of SGMA compliance. The sources point out that a massive, well-capitalized corporate farm has an entirely different set of survival strategies compared to a small family grower.
Absolutely. A large operation with deep financial reserves can afford the transition costs. As water trading markets emerge under SGMA, a corporate grower has the capital to simply buy water allocations from other users at a premium price to keep their most lucrative orchards alive.
So they just buy their way out of the deficit.
Or they can afford the massive upfront costs of tearing out water-heavy crops and planting what the PPIC terms SGMA-ready crops.
What's a SGMA-ready crop?
Like winter wheat or specific low-water varietals. They can do this even if it means taking a loss for several years during the transition.
But if you are a smaller grower operating on tight margins, you don't have millions of dollars to spend on the open water market. You can't afford to weather 5 years of negative income while transitioning your fields.
Right.
The fear is that the compliance burden will trigger a massive consolidation of land where small operators are forced out and only the largest agricultural conglomerates survive the audit.
That is a very prominent critique of how the implementation is unfolding. However, the sources also clearly present the counter perspective from environmental and social justice advocates.
Okay, what do they say?
They argue that the romanticization of the pre-SGMA era ignores who was actually being harmed by the unregulated status quo.
Oh, because it was those exact same small rural communities whose domestic drinking wells were going dry when the big farms were running their deep pumps.
Precisely. The counter-argument is that the rule of capture was already a predatory system that favored the wealthy and jeopardized the vulnerable. In this view, SGMA isn't destroying the valley, it is simply forcing the valley to finally acknowledge the physical limits of its environment.
Both perspectives are reacting to the sheer stress of operating in a landscape where the foundational resource is shrinking by 20%. It forces you to ask, can 500,000 acres sustainably transition to new water models, or is this just the end of the line for a massive chunk of American agriculture? Will we just see vast stretches of the valley revert to dust bowls and abandoned orchards?
Well, the success of the transition depends heavily on mitigating those subtractions with additions. SGMA forces the valley to balance the ledger, but cutting spending isn't the only way to balance a budget.
You can also increase deposits.
Exactly.
Right, the sources detail this counter melody of addition. If extreme droughts caused the pumping surges that created the overdraft, the theory is that extreme wet years can be leveraged to repay that debt.
We were talking about managed aquifer recharge, and specifically a strategy called flood MA.
I found the mechanics of flood MAR fascinating because it requires a complete paradigm shift in how California views floodwater. Historically, when those massive atmospheric rivers hit the state and dump incredible amounts of snow and rain on the Sierras, the entire water management system goes into defense mode.
Oh, absolutely. The traditional engineering philosophy for the last century has been rapid conveyance. You channel the floodwater into concrete-lined riverbeds, bypasses, and massive canals, and you rush it out to the Pacific Ocean as quickly as physically possible to prevent cities and agricultural land from flooding.
You essentially treat the water as a hazardous waste product that needs to be disposed of.
Exactly. Get it out of here. But FloodMAR proposes the opposite approach. It stands for Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge. The strategy is to intentionally open the diversion gates and spread that excess floodwater out across designated agricultural fields, dormant orchards, and specially engineered recharge basins.
You purposefully flood the land.
You let the water sit there, sometimes several feet deep, and you allow it to slowly percolate down through the soil profile, past the root zones, and into the underlying aquifer. You use the surface of the earth as a massive passive funnel to refill the depleted underground storage zones.
It's a brilliant concept for making a massive deposit back into the savings account. But the source material is very clear about the physical limits of the strategy. We have to evaluate its actual viability. First of all, as we discussed with the physics of subsidence, flood MAR cannot fix the clay.
No. Pumping water back into the ground cannot reverse the irreversible compaction of those platelets. The storage capacity lost to subsidence is gone forever. You are only refilling the pore spaces in the sand and gravel layers that haven't collapsed.
Furthermore, the analyses show that even under the most aggressive modeling, flood MAR cannot capture enough water to entirely close the fallowing gap. It is not a silver bullet that saves all 900,000 at-risk acres.
It changes the arithmetic, but it doesn't eliminate the deficit. Banking massive amounts of water during a flood year provides a critical buffer for the inevitable dry years, softening the economic blow. But scaling FloodMap from a promising pilot concept to a valley-wide solution involves staggering logistical hurdles.
This is where my brain kept snagging when reading the reports. The theory of flooding a field sounds simple, but the reality of capturing an atmospheric river feels like trying to catch a waterfall with a thimble, or like trying to charge an iPhone with a lightning strike.
I love that analogy.
The sheer volume of energy, or in this case, water, is definitely there, but the battery can only accept the input at a very specific, slow trickle rate. If you dump all that energy into the system at once, you blow up the grid.
That is exactly the mechanical problem. An atmospheric river doesn't deliver a gentle, steady rain spread perfectly over 6 months. It delivers billions of gallons of water in a violent surge over a matter of days. To capture that surge without causing catastrophic flooding, you need massive diversion weirs, high-capacity turnout canals, and incredibly precise flow models to ensure you don't accidentally wash away a town or drown a live orchard that can't tolerate submerged roots.
You need the infrastructure to quickly move the water off the raging river and onto the specific fields with the right soil types for percolation. And a lot of that infrastructure simply doesn't exist yet.
And beyond the physical engineering, you have the legal engineering.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. California water rights law is labyrinthine. If a GSA diverts floodwater onto a private farmer's field to recharge the aquifer, who actually owns that water once it goes underground?
Right. If the aquifer is a shared, unpartitioned bowl, why should I agree to drown my own fields and risk my crops for the collective good if my neighbor can just sink a well and pump that exact same water out to irrigate their farm?
The legal framework for accounting, crediting, and extracting recharged groundwater is still being hotly contested. These policy hurdles are incredibly complex, and they inherently slow down the deployment of FloodMan.
But the atmosphere doesn't wait for policy committees to figure out the legal accounting. In 2023, nature bypassed the bureaucracy entirely and provided a spectacular, unplanned demonstration of what happens when massive floodwaters have nowhere else to go.
Which introduces the most surreal chapter of our sources, the return of Tulare Lake.
This is nature's ultimate audit. And to understand the gravity of what happened in 2023, we have to look at the history of this ghost lake. Before I read these specific sources, I honestly had no idea that a body of water of this magnitude ever existed in the San Joaquin Valley.
Most people don't, because the engineering that erased it was so comprehensive. Prior to 1850, the southern San Joaquin Valley was not the arid expanse of cotton and tomato fields we see today. It was the home of Tulare Lake, a permanent, massive inland sea.
It was fed by 4 major Sierra Nevada rivers: the Kings, the Coaya, the Toutle, and the Kern rivers. When the snowmelt came rushing out of the mountains, it didn't flow to the ocean. It pooled in this massive, shallow basin.
It was the largest body of freshwater west of the Mississippi River. The historical accounts describe a vast aquatic ecosystem spanning hundreds of square miles, teeming with fish, turtles, and millions of migratory birds navigating the Pacific Flyway.
Wow.
And it was a cultural and physical center of the universe for the Tachiyucat people, who built their lives, their villages, and their economy along its shores.
So how does a lake larger than Lake Tahoe just vanish?
It was systematically engineered out of existence by the late 19th century agricultural boom. Settlers and land barons looked at the lake bed and realized that the soil beneath the water was composed of incredibly rich, deep peat and sediment, some of the most fertile dirt on the planet.
So the goal became to dry it out so they could farm it.
Exactly. Between the 1870s and the early 1900s, massive reclamation projects were launched. They built enormous levees using steam-powered dredges. They dammed the 4 tributary rivers up in the foothills, capturing the water before it could reach the valley floor. And they dug massive diversion canals to redirect that water strictly for irrigation.
They essentially starved the lake of its inflow. Over decades, the intense California sun evaporated the remaining water, and the massive inland sea was transformed into an endless grid of highly lucrative agricultural fields. For over a century, Tulare Lake was just a ghost, an anomaly on old historical maps.
Until the winter of 2022 and the spring of 2023.
The year the atmospheric rivers broke the system. The sources detail a winter of unrelenting storms. The Sierra Nevada snowpack reached record-shattering levels, and as the temperatures warmed in the spring, that historic snowpack began to rapidly melt.
The volume of runoff screaming down those four historical rivers completely overwhelmed the modern infrastructure. The dams hit capacity, the diversion canals maxed out, the levees breached.
And the water, obeying the immutable laws of gravity, sought the lowest point in the valley. It went exactly back to where it had always lived.
The ghost lake woke up. Tulare Lake returned to its exact historical footprint.
It is staggering. The floodwaters breached the levees and poured across the farmland, submerging roughly 90,000 plus acres of Kings County. Some local estimates put the inundated area even higher.
Just massive destruction.
Yeah, the water drowned massive, multi-million-dollar agricultural operations, completely surrounded the city of Corcoran, which itself has sunk significantly over the decades due to groundwater pumping, and threatened rural communities like Allensworth and Elpaw.
When we view this event through the lens of our ledger metaphor, it serves as the ultimate proof of an undeniable physical reality. You can drain a basin, you can pump the groundwater from beneath it, you can build levees and pave roads across it, but you do not make the water gone. You merely borrow against the geography.
The topography of the earth remained a bowl. It was just a bowl waiting to be filled.
Our sources include a truly poignant first-person narrative from a lifelong Californian who drove out to witness the return of the lake. And their framing of the event is incredibly evocative. They describe standing on a temporary dirt berm, looking out across water that stretched to the horizon, seeing the water, finding its old address.
Finding its old address. I love that phrasing. They talk about the surreal psychological dissonance of watching waves chop across a landscape they had known their entire life as bone-dry farmland, seeing utility poles sticking out of the water like channel markers, and heavy farm equipment completely swallowed by the inland sea.
But the narrator also makes a crucial, highly self-aware observation. They acknowledge the privilege of being a spectator. While they could stand on the edge and marvel at this awe-inspiring spectacle of nature reclaiming its territory, they did not have to bear the agonizing economic brunt of that return.
Right. And this highlights the deeply conflicting realities present in the source material regarding the lake's return. For the local agricultural community, this was not a marvel. It was a devastating economic catastrophe.
Growers were forced to watch generations of equity, infrastructure, and carefully tended crops suffocate under 10 feet of murky, stagnant water. And because the basin has no natural outlet, the water couldn't just drain away to the ocean after the storms passed.
It just sat there.
Yeah, the sources note the water lingered for over a year into 2024, keeping that ground completely out of production and severely impacting the farm workers who rely on those fields for their wages.
It's an immense tragedy for the current economy of Kings County. But simultaneously, the sources present the perspective of the Tachiyokut tribe.
Right. For the Tachiyokut, the event was not a flood. It was a restoration. It was the resurrection of their ancestral homeland. The reports describe tribal members taking boats out onto the water, holding ceremonies, and welcoming the lake back as a profound moment of spiritual healing.
To them, the 130 years of dry farmland was the temporary artificial anomaly, and the lake was the truth of the landscape reasserting itself. It forces a massive paradigm shift. It's as if the earth itself stepped in as the ultimate auditor, looking at the century of drained rivers and overpumped aquifers, foreclosing on the valley and simply stating, "This land is mine."
It really makes you wonder if it is fundamentally possible to engineer long-term static sustainability against a geography that possesses so much latent energy to revert to an inland sea.
That is the ultimate test facing SGMA and the local GSAs. You cannot out-engineer gravity, and you cannot permanently cheat hydrology. The water will inevitably seek its level, and the physical shape of the earth will dictate where it goes.
The challenge of achieving sustainability is no longer about defeating the geography. It is about figuring out how to successfully adapt a massive agricultural economy to the strict, undeniable realities of the ledger.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've looked at the invisible ledger, a century of unregulated groundwater pumping that treated the aquifer like a bottomless vault, triggering a race to the bottom that left rural communities hauling bottled water.
We explored the irreversible physics of that overdraft, how the collapse of the microscopic clay layers led to a staggering 28 feet of land subsidence, permanently destroying the aquifer's storage capacity and buckling the canals meant to bring relief.
We examined the legal reckoning of SGMA, which gives the valley a generation to fix a century of deficit, and faced the brutal mathematics projecting that upwards of 900,000 acres of farmland may need to be permanently fallowed, fundamentally restructuring the rural economy.
We also looked at the potential of flood bar to capture extreme weather and soften that blow.
And finally, we witnessed the majestic, sobering return of Tulare Lake in 2023, a vivid reminder that the land has a memory much longer than our own. And as the sources make clear, how this ledger ultimately balances out is still entirely unwritten.
Right. The sustainability of the new water models is being tested in real time. The immense burden of transition and how it impacts the small farmers and disadvantaged communities versus the large operations is a reality unfolding right now.
The reckoning is not a historical event. It is the present reality of the San Joaquin Valley. Which leaves us with one final thought for you to consider, mulling over everything we've talked about today. We spend so much of our lives categorizing what is permanent and what is temporary based on our own short lifespans. But if satellite radar from orbit proves that the ground beneath our feet has been forever changed by our pumps, and an atmospheric river can resurrect a 150-year-old ghost lake in a matter of weeks, perhaps we need to ask ourselves a deeper question about how we measure time.
Yeah.
We look at the 19th century draining of the valley as a permanent triumph of human engineering, and we look at the 2023 flood as a terrifying temporary anomaly. But in the grand scope of geologic time, what if the 100-year history of dry farming in the San Joaquin Valley was the temporary anomaly? What if the water wasn't invading? What if it has simply been waiting just beneath the surface to reclaim its permanent home, and the ledger has finally, simply come due? Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the ground beneath your feet.